Well, there's an undercurrent to this story, and that is also the story of the flood, and that's the fact that the city can become corrupt because people don't engage in heroic endeavor, or perhaps because they engage in precisely the opposite of that, which is outright destructive behavior. And this is also something that's worth considering too, because if you consider your own manner of being, you can say things to people like tell the truth and be good, and those are cliches, obviously, and so they lack power because they're cliches. But you can take them apart and utilize them in a manner that stops being a cliche, and you do that by being more humble about them, I would say, because maybe you can't tell the truth because you don't know what the truth is. But one thing you can do is you can stop saying things that you know to be untrue. And you might say, well, how do I know that they're untrue? And the answer to that is, well, you need a whole philosophy of truth, the elaboration of an entire philosophy of truth to answer that question. And so we're not going to bother answering that question because in some sense at the moment it's beside the point. That isn't the issue. The issue is there are times in your life where you know that the thing that you're saying is not true. It's a deception, it's a lie of some sort, and you're using it to manipulate yourself or another person or the world. And you're also possessed, fully possessed of the idea that you can get away with it. And there's a satanic arrogance about that. In fact, that is the archetypal arrogance that's portrayed in the mythological character of Satan, because Satan is precisely the archetype of the element of the mind that believes that it can twist and bend the structure of reality without paying the price for that. And you can't imagine anything that's more arrogant than that, because really, do you really think that you can twist the structure of a reality and that that's going to work out for you without it snapping back? It's so obvious that that can't work, that everyone knows it. But anyways, back to the initial point, is that by the rules of the game that you yourself are playing, that some of the times you're violating the rules of the game that you're playing. And the first issue with regards to, say, stating the truth or behaving in a responsible manner would be merely stop cheating at whatever game it is that you've chosen to play. That's a good start, and that'll straighten out your life. It'll start to straighten out your life. And so, well, the flood, how does the flood tie into this? Well, we live in a corrupt structure. We're corrupt as individuals. We live in a corrupt structure, and part of that corruption is just happenstance. It's the way things fall apart. But the other part of it is that not only are we not aiming up, we're actually aiming down. And the flood story is a warning, and it's a very clear warning. And the warning is, if you aim down enough, and then if enough of you aim down at the same time, everything will degenerate into something that's indistinguishable from the chaos from which things emerged at the beginning of time. It's something like that, because the cosmos that's presented in mythological representations is chaos versus order, right? The order is on top, you might say, and the chaos is always underneath. And the chaos can break through, or the order can crumble, and you can fall into the chaos, and that chaos is intermingled potential. And the way that you destroy the order and let the chaos rise back up, which is exactly how it's portrayed in the flood story, is by inhabiting the corpse of your father. That's one mythological motif, and feeding on the remains, and with no gratitude and no attempt to replenish what it is that you're taking from. And the warning in the flood story is, don't do that for very long, because things will happen that are so awful you cannot possibly imagine it. And that'll happen to you personally, and it'll happen to your family, and it'll happen to your community, and it's happened to people over and over throughout history. And it's quite interesting, it's very soon after the story of Cain and Abel when you see evil enter the world in the story of Adam and Eve, along with self-consciousness. And evil there is the ability, that's the knowledge of good and evil, that's the ability to hurt other people self-consciously, to know what you're doing. And then, of course, instantly, Cain takes that to the absolute extreme, and he uses that capacity to destroy really what he loves best. He gets as close as a human being can to destroying the divine ideal, because of course his brother is Abel, and Abel is favored by God, and Cain destroys him, which Cain tells God at the end of that episode that his punishment is more than he can bear. And I think the reason for that is, where are you once you destroy your own ideal? What's left for you? There's nowhere to go. There's no up. And when there's no up, there's a lot of down. And you know, there's an idea that was put forth very nicely in Milton's Paradise Lost when he was describing, from a psychological perspective, essentially what hell is. And hell is, you're in hell to the degree that you're distant from the good. That might be a good way of thinking about it. And if you destroy your own ideal, which you do with jealousy and resentment and the desire to pull down people who you would like to be, let's say, then you end up in a situation that's indistinguishable from hell. And the way the story, the biblical story unfolds is, well, it's Cain, and then it's the flood. And so Cain adopts this mode of being that's antithetical to being itself, at least to positive being itself. He does it voluntarily. He does it knowing full well what he's doing. And the net consequence of this, that as it ripples through the entire social structure, is that God stands back and says, this whole thing has got so bad, the only thing we can do is wipe it to the ground. And that is no joke. That's exactly how things work. And one of the things that's extraordinarily terrifying about that sequence of stories, and I believe this to be true, I think I realized this independently of any of the analysis that I was doing of mythological stories, because I looked at what happened in places like the Soviet Union and Maoist China and in Nazi Germany, and the most penetrating observers of those societies, the people who were most interested in how it was that those absolute catastrophes came about, all said the same thing. It was rooted in the degeneration of the individuals who made up the society. You know, you hear, well, people were following orders. It's like, no, that explanation doesn't hold water. Or that you'd be punished if you resisted. Well, there was some truth in that, but nowhere near as much as people might think, especially at the beginnings of the process. More it was that people decided, each and every one of them, to turn a blind eye to the catastrophes and to participate in the lies. And that warped the entire societies, and they went as, you know, they veered their way downward to something as closely approximating hell as you could hope to manage, especially in places like Nazi Germany and, well, in all three of those places, in Maoist China and in the Soviet Union. And so the thing that's so frightening about, one of the things that's so frightening about the stories in Genesis is they say something very clear, which is that your moral degeneration contributes in no small way to the degeneration of the entire cosmos. And you say, well, I would like my life to be meaningful. People say that. Really, would you? Really? You really would like your life to be meaningful? You think maybe people would trade a little nihilism to not have to face that particular realization, and I think people do that all the time. It's a terrible weight to realize, but we are networked together. That's the price of, or let's say, that's the vulnerability that's associated with our intense capacity to communicate. And it is certainly possible that the ripples of our individual actions have consequences that are far beyond the limits of our immediate consciousness. And I also think people know that too. They know that in the way that people know things when they don't want to know them, which means they know them embodied, they can feel them, they can sense them, they have an emotional response to them, but there's no damn way they're going to let them become articulate because they don't want to know. And when you're feeling guilty and ashamed about the things you've done or not done, and I know that can get out of hand as well, it's often because there is a crooked little part of you that's aiming at the worst possible outcome. You know, one of the things Jung said about the shadow, you know, that Jung's famous idea that everyone has a dark side and that dark side needs to be incorporated and made conscious. Jung said that the shadow of the human being reaches all the way to hell. And he actually, that's the thing that's so interesting about reading Carl Jung, is he actually means what he says. It's not a metaphor. It's like the part of you that's twisted against being is aligned with the part of the cosmos, let's say, the conscious cosmos, that's aiming at making everything as terrible as it can possibly be. And, you know, it's a terrible shock to realize that. It's partly why people don't realize it. It's something that people keep at an arm's length. It's the same as recognizing yourself as a Nazi concentration camp guard, which is a very useful exercise because there's absolutely no reason why you couldn't have been or still could be one. So, and if you think otherwise, then all the more reason for assuming that you would be unable to resist the temptation if it was in fact offered to you. And if you don't think it's a temptation, then then there's so much that you don't know about human beings that you're not even in the game, because if it wasn't a temptation, then people bloody well wouldn't have done it, and plenty of people did it, and it's no wonder. So things get serious in Genesis very, very rapidly, and the depth of the seriousness is ultimate, archetypal. That's it. It gets as serious as it can get. The story of Noah and the flood opens in a fragmentary manner, and I believe that these passages are part of a longer story that we only have bits and pieces of, and also one that's fragmented in its parts of more than one story. And it starts like this: it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Now there's an idea there. There's two ways of looking at the past, and you can kind of see that in the political landscape that we inhabit now. On the more conservative end of the spectrum, people regard the past as the land of giants, right? They were the heroes of the past who established the current conditions that we exist in, and then the people on the left are more concerned perhaps with the what would you call it, with the lineage of corruption that's come down through the centuries. And both of those perspectives are accurate. You can say, well, there were the great heroes of the past who established our modes of being. You can think of them as composite beings if you want. That's fine. It's a perfectly reasonable way of thinking about it. And you can also think of the accumulation of corruption and evil that's come along the centuries as well. And so you see both of those reflected in these initial few lines. That the sons of gods, so those are the heroes, saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all of which they chose. Then this statement comes in as somewhat of a non sequitur. And the Lord said, my spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he is also flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. And I looked at a variety of interpretations of that line, because it doesn't seem to follow so clearly from the previous line, and exactly what it means isn't obvious. But it seems to be, the first line talks about the heroes of the past, and the second line says, wait a second, there's something corrupt about the human mode of being. And one of the consequences of that, as far as God is concerned, is that there are conditions under which the divine spirit will not strive with man. What that means is there are conditions under which, let's say, I don't think there's any other way of putting it, is the divine impulse towards the good will abandon you because of things that you've done. And then the secondary consideration here is that perhaps because of the degeneration of people, it's not so obvious here that our lifespans are limited, that the spirit that inhabits us will only do so for a limited amount of time. And that's tangled in a strange way in with the idea of human moral culpability. And that's posed against the notion of the giants of the past. And then it returns to the giant idea, the narrative returns to the giant idea and reads, there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of men came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, and the same became mighty men which are of old, men of renown. And that's the end of that sequence of fragments. It's very broken, but you can see a dual narrative underneath it. And one of the narratives is that there's the kind of corruption, despite the nature of the giants of the past, there's the kind of corruption lurking that would cause God to withhold his grace and allow men to deteriorate. And that sets the stage for Noah and the flood. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. You know, one of the things I really didn't like about going to church when I was a kid, I went to a pretty moderate church. It was the United Church, which has hardly even become a church now. It's so moderate, so to speak. One of the things I didn't like was the constant harping by the ministry on the sinful nature of human beings. Like, it didn't speak to me properly, partly because I really didn't understand what it meant, and partly because it seemed, well, sort of, what would you say, was self-flagellating in an unattractive way. I don't know if there is an attractive way to be self-flagellating, but and there was something about it that was also rote and fake that I didn't like. But, you know, in later years I thought about that more, and I started to understand that there was some real utility in asking people to keep the evil that they're doing clear and conscious in the forefront of their imagination. I think I mentioned to you guys last week this little episode from what we know of Mesopotamian culture surrounding the emperor. The New Year's festival, they would take the emperor outside of the walled city and strip him of his garb so that he was reduced to just an ordinary man, and then humiliate him ritually, and then ask him how it was over the last year that he wasn't a spectacular embodiment of Marduk. And Marduk was the Mesopotamian deity who made order out of chaos, essentially. And the emperor was supposed to sit and think, okay, well, you know, I'm emperor and everything. I should be doing a good job. Maybe I should even be doing a great job. And probably I'm coming up short in a bunch of ways. And that actually happens to be important since I'm running the entire show. I should be very, very cognizant of how I'm failing to live up to the ideal. And that is what that call, that constant clarion call that's degenerated, I would say, in institutional Christianity, that was actually the idea, was, look, there's a bunch of ways that you're not being everything you could be. And it is not supposed to be a whip to knock you down, although maybe it's a whip to knock down your pride, the pride that stops you from being aware of your insufficiencies. It's more like a call to the opposite. It's like, well, you should stop doing those things because you could be so much more than you are, and that would be so much better for you and everyone else that it's just not good that you continue doing these things, continue breaking your own rules, let's say. Because we could certainly, as I said, we could start this game by assuming that you should at least play the game that you're playing straight. And so, and it is the case that if you watch yourself, it's a terrifying thing to do, but if you watch yourself, you'll see you lie a lot. Like when I learned this to begin with, I was in my 20s, and I'm a smart person, and I was very proud of that, because I was also a small person. I was moved ahead one year in school, and I was a small person to begin with, and so I was a very small person in my classes, and also very mouthy, which might not come as much of a surprise, and somewhat provocative. And so, you know, and I got pushed around a fair bit because everybody gets pushed around, and my weapon was to be mouthy, and it was a fairly effective weapon, although it tended to backfire because, you know, if you're really effectively mouthy with large, obnoxious people, then they tend to respond in a relatively negative physical way. And so that sort of thing was happening to me a fair bit. But I was quite proud of the fact that I had some intellectual power. And that it was then in my 20s when I learned about some of the danger of that, because I started to read partly Milton's Paradise Lost, and I started to understand the danger of the intellect. And the danger of the intellect, as far as I can tell, is that it tends towards pride and arrogance, and it also tends to fall in love with its own productions. And so that's actually Lucifer. In Paradise Lost, that's Lucifer. Lucifer is the intellect that falls in love with its own productions and then assumes that there's nothing outside of what it thinks. That's the totalitarian mentality, right? It's like we have a total system and we know how everything works, and we're going to implement it, and that'll bring about heaven on earth, right? That's the totalitarian mindset, and that's associated with intellectual arrogance. And at the same time, another thing was happening to me. So I was noticing that. I started to understand what that meant. And I also started to understand that there was more to life than the intellect, much more. Because I smoked too much, and I drank too much, and I weighed like 130 pounds. I wasn't in good physical shape. And like I had a lot of things to do when I went to graduate school to put myself together. And at the same time, I was trying to understand why things had gone so crazily wrong with the world, its encapsulation in the Cold War, and what role I might be playing in that, if any, or what role any of us were playing in that. At the same time, I was working at a prison only a little bit. I worked with this crazy psychologist. He used to put jokes on his multiple choice tests. He was a really eccentric guy, but I really liked his courses. He taught a course on creativity, and he was also a prison psychologist, and he was an eccentric guy, and he for some reason liked me, and maybe because I was eccentric too, and he invited me to go out to the Edmonton maximum security prison with him a couple of times, which I did, and that was a very interesting experience because I was trying to figure out what role each individual's behavior bore to the pathology of the group. It was something like that. And I went out there and I met a little guy, smaller than me. I was a little bigger by then. And he was a pretty innocuous guy. And what had happened was I was out in this gymnasium. It looks like a high school, a prison, which is really quite telling in my estimation. And there were all these like monsters in there, weightlifting, and like they were monsters. I remember one guy who was tattooed everywhere, and he had like a huge scar running down the middle of his chest. It looked like someone had hit him with an axe, and you know, and I was in there, and I had this weird cape that I used to wear that I bought in Portugal, and some boots that went along with it. And yeah, it was like an 1890s Sherlock Holmes cape, and it was really like it was from the 1890s because this little village was up on a hill. It was a walled city on a hill, and they sold these things, and I don't think they'd changed the style since 1890, and so I thought they were really cool, and so I was wearing that, which wasn't perhaps the most conservative garb to don if you're going to go to a maximum security prison. So anyways, I was in the gymnasium, and the psychologist left, and God only knows. I mean, that's what he was like, and all these guys came around me, you know, and they were offering to trade their prison clothes for my cape, and it was it was like I was being made an offer I couldn't refuse, you know, and so I didn't really know what to do. And then this little guy said something like that the psychologist sent me to come and take you away or something like that. And so I thought, well, better this little guy than all these monsters. So we went outside the gym through some doors, like school doors. We went outside the gym into the exercise yard, I guess, and we were wandering along, and he was talking to me, and he seemed like a kind of an innocuous guy. And then the psychologist showed up at the door and motioned us back, and so, which was kind of a relief. And so I went into his office, and he said, "You know that guy that you walked out in the yard with?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, he took two cops one night, and he had them kneel down, and while they were begging for their lives, he shot them both in the back of the head. And I thought, see, the thing that was so interesting was that he was so innocuous, right? Because what you'd hope is that someone like that would be very much unlike you, let's say,